Hello, and welcome to A Healthy Mind. I'm Dr. Cislina Grosser-Ledbetter, Director of Counseling and Student Development at the University of the District of Columbia, and your host. On today's edition, our issue is the stigma of homosexuality. Here to talk about this issue is my guest, Dr. Reginald Nettles. Dr. Nettles is representing LGBT Counseling, which is a referral network for the LGBT community in metropolitan Washington, D.C. Dr. Nettles completed his PhD in community clinical psychology at Howard University, go Howard, and is a licensed psychologist and certified group psychotherapist. He provides individual, group, and couples therapy in private practice in Columbia, Maryland. He is currently a guest faculty member of the National Group Psychotherapy Institute Group Therapy Training Program at the Washington School of Psychiatry in Washington, D.C., and he is an adjunct faculty member teaching group counseling at the University of Baltimore. He has served on several committees focused on LGBT, racial and ethnic minority and disability issues in the American Psychological Association and the Maryland Psychological Association. He is the author of Multiple Minority Identities in Group Psychotherapy Within and Between, which appears in his recently co-edited book, Multiple Minority Identities, Applications for Practice, Research, and Training. Welcome, Dr. Nettles. You have done quite a bit.
Thank you.
And I am just so thrilled to have you on. We've had wonderful conversation offline, and I would love to know if you could share with our audience how you began and how you got to where you are representing the LGBT community and stigma. I was at the World Conference on AIDS this year, and there was lots of conversation about stigma. So let's talk about how you got to where you are, making all of these meaningful contributions, and then you can tell us a little bit about what stigma is.
Okay. Your question is a good one. And as you ask it, the first thing I think about is, I came to know about stigma as a young child, growing up black as a young black child, and I knew from early childhood that the way we were treated wasn't the way other people were treated or regarded. And that's almost a textbook definition of a certain kind of stigma, the racial stigma. So I grew up knowing that, but I also grew up in a family where prejudice, discrimination about other people was simply not accepted. So I had little friends who were little gay boys.
Yeah.
I knew who they were. They knew we all knew who we were. Mm-hmm. And I also had a disability as a child. And I also knew how people with disabilities were treated as well, having one.
I see. Was your disability visible?
It was visible.
Okay.
It was visible then. It became invisible as I got older. It's become visible again.
Okay.
So that's just kind of the way that goes. So I grew up being sensitized. In fact, I grew up at a time when racial segregation was hitting the North.
Did you grow up in the North?
I grew up in the North.
Okay.
I grew up in Mount Vernon, New York.
Mount Vernon?
Yes.
I grew up in White Plains.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my goodness, off
Okay.
the air.
And
That's great.
I was in third grade in 1954.
Yes.
After the civil rights school desegregation laws were passed,
Right.
and it was at that point that segregation hit the North, because there was gerrymandering of school districts in reaction to the laws that outlawed segregation in the South. So from that point forward, I've been sensitized to the way certain people are treated differently.
So is stigma about shame? Is it about what you can see? Can you be stigmatized if the issue is not visible? So we get it. We can't wash the skin color off.
Right.
Right? But is it about that?
From a historical perspective, there are three kinds of stigmas. One is the so-called tribal or racial stigma. Skin color is seen as a racial stigma and can be passed on from one generation to the next, and it's one of the big three, so to speak.
Right.
Physical disability, defined historically as abominations of the body. And then the third characteristic, or the third group, has to do with so-called blemishes of individual character. Things like criminal behavior, alcoholism, drug addiction, radical political beliefs, and homosexuality. All were considered historically blemishes of individual character. The concept of stigma grows from the ancient Greece, the ancient Greek approach, or the ancient Greek understanding of stigma. It was seen as a mark that gave evidence of something bad or immoral about the person who carried the stigma.
So I'm thinking about stigma, and I'm thinking about my question that often comes up and resonates. Is it, and maybe it doesn't matter, but are you born gay, because we're talking about LGBT, or is it something that you make the decision to be? And does it matter in the context of stigma?
Well, at a certain level, it doesn't matter. In some ways, the jury is still out in terms of what are the causes of same-gender sexuality.
Right.
We don't really know what causes heterosexuality. We don't really understand fully what causes sexual orientation, one kind or the other. The best research that we have so far suggests that it's probably a combination of genetic predispositions and social factors.
Okay.
Either way, we know that it can be experienced and recognized from very early on.
Okay. And so that kind of leads me right into, what does it mean then to be gay?
What does it mean?
What does it mean to be gay?
What it means is to have an enduring sexual or affectional preference for people of the same gender.
Can you be gay and not be sexual?
Yes. People often recognize their sexual orientation long before they have any sexual contact or sexual interest in anybody in particular. But people know within themselves often enough that their orientation is one way or the other.
And so in your work, talk a little bit about the work that you do in terms of treating stigma and how it shows up in your practice. How do you deal with it, and what do you usually see?
Well, there are two ways that I see it. I see it with racial and ethnic minorities. A lot of the clients that I work with are Black or belong to other racial or ethnic minorities. And sometimes what is presented has to do with a kind of a racial self-hate, or having been exposed to some of the same kinds of things that I was exposed to, but may not have had some of the correctives that help people know that Black people really don't conform to the stereotypes.
So then you're talking about dealing with people who in some ways have been traumatized by racial stigma and not necessarily LGBT.
Exactly. Can be one, can be the other. That's a part of why I wrote about multiple minority identities. Racial identities, we all kind of understand that racial minorities are treated badly in our culture. What people have not fully understood is that sexual minorities as well have been treated very badly in our culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're getting that.
I think we're getting that.
I think we're getting that. In fact, there's been some legislation,
Yes.
right? The repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. How has that shown up, or how has that resonated in the LGBT community? And has it shown up in your practice?
It has not shown up. I take that back. It has shown up in my practice. People that I see will talk about it.
Veterans?
I don't see many veterans in my practice. I did have an experience working on a military base, and this was before Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It was right on the cusp. It was when that was in the air. It was just a couple of years ago. And my sense is that people were reluctant, even in the context of therapy, to divulge that aspect of themselves.
What are some of the standard things that you find that happen when we talk about stigma or the coming out? What happens as a result of admitting that you are gay? Is it just the looks and is it something deeper? What really happens? What do you see coming to you that shows and reveals the kind of pain that those of us who don't experience that come to know?
Well, what I see in my practice, people who come to me and are either troubled by the way they've been treated as LGBT people, or even if they, well, I would say even if they haven't been treated badly recently, more often than not, what I really get is a sense of what they went through as they were growing up.
Wow.
People have been traumatized by the way they were treated, the way they were beaten, the way they were rejected by family and parents, the way they were hurt in growing up. And that pain stays with people, and that colors what they bring to therapy.
Yeah, and you know what's really interesting? I think I must have been third, fourth grade. And I had, because my grandmother was really into the furs and the stuff that Peter would just not be happy with right now, right? The animal rights people, so, you know, forgive me. But I had this cool little rabbit. I called it a rabbit coat. I don't really know if it was real or not, but it was just really cool. And I wore it to school. And the first time I realized that I was very different, this girl comes up to me and says, I know that can't be real. And so many years later, I still remember sitting there and this Caucasian girl coming up to me saying, I know that could not be real. As if to say, there's no way you can afford this coat. Because you're colored. So I kind of resonate with the whole idea that these childhood hurts and pains can follow you. And I bet in your practice some of them come out and they're not even there for that.
Right. People may not be there for that, but as they begin to talk about what they are there for, then the pain surfaces. And having done this for a long time, I recognize, I recognize what's being suggested, and I also know some things about the history. So I know what to go for. I kind of know what questions to ask, and I do wonder, what was it like for you? You know, if you're gay now, and you know that, and you're accepting of that, when did that start for you, and how did that start?
And usually, how far back? Like, when do you know?
That is a really interesting question, and there are research perspectives and there are clinical perspectives. From a research perspective, we know that typically middle school to high school, kids begin to, quote, come out, or come to recognize this. From a clinical perspective, my sense is that people often knew when they were little.
Little?
Little.
Really? Okay.
I'll tell you just a quick little personal story. I've, in recent years, used the internet to kind of reconnect with people that I knew as a child. Just kind of, where are the little gay boys now? And there was one little boy, I knew him when I was 7 or 8 years old. And I figured that out when I contacted him finally. We got
like now, recently, you figured it out.
Well, recently I contacted him, came out to him, talked with him, and he reminded me that he moved away when he was 10, and he's 2 years older than me. So I haven't seen him since I was 8 years old, and I remember him as one of the little gay boys that I used to play with.
Did you guys all know? Did you all know that you were? I mean, at 7, you all knew.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, you know, my best friend when I was 7, he was 5. We knew.
Wow.
So people know.
Let me ask you this. Is there, there is a thinking, a thought, or maybe this is my thinking, that there is there are some people that become gay as a result of abuse. Have you heard that?
I've heard that. I'm aware of some of the theory that gives rise
Yes.
to that. I don't believe it's true.
Okay.
I don't believe that there's any really solid research that supports that notion. I don't believe that people become gay because they were abused. What I do believe is that sometimes little boys and little girls who are destined to become gay are noticed and therefore become abused.
Why do you think there's so much abuse in the church? I know this just like came out of left field, right? But
Yeah,
I was
sure
trying to
did.
lead you into it. I was trying to lead
Well,
you into it, Dr. Nettles.
That's a
What-
good question.
Yeah.
You know, as we talk about psychological stigma, I think there's a real connection.
Yeah.
Because one of the impacts of psychological stigma is that people work really hard to hide the stigmatized characteristic. So if you have to hide it, or if you feel you have to hide it, then it doesn't feel comfortable to live it out openly. So people sometimes live it out secretively.
I see.
And children are vulnerable.
Yes, they are.
And of course, now there's an important difference between adult same-gender sexuality and pedophilia. Those are different. But often pedophiles will find themselves in certain situations where they're trusted and can take advantage of children.
So one of your tenets is that this culture supports stigma. Talk about why, and I understand that it's the Western culture, and I don't know whether you make the distinction between Western culture supporting stigma versus Eastern, or just because we're in the Western culture that it supports stigma.
Yeah, that's a good question. I talk about Western culture because it's the culture I know
Okay.
best.
All
But my sense is that certain stigmas are pretty cross-cultural, and that other cultures may stigmatize on similar or different bases. Keep in mind that the concept of stigma grew out of ancient Greece, which, if we go back far enough, we have to really ask ourselves: is that the same culture as we have today? I think it's very. I think it was very different, but there were spiritual and certain moral tenets that caused people to be stigmatized for various reasons. Again, if we go back to the definition of stigma, it speaks to to something bad about the person, something immoral, some mark.
And you think that our culture supports the stigmatization of that group?
It supports is is an interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah.
In many aspects of our culture, people are stigmatized.
Right. Okay. I
But
get
I
that.
think we live in changing times. This is not as prevalent as it was. For instance, I'm very glad to see that bullying has been named. Well, when I was growing up, the kind of things that are called bullying now went on freely. So kids could be teased about being, or about having gender atypical behaviors or being presumed to be gay. Kids could be teased openly.
Right. And there's still a lot of work to be done.
A lot of work
It's
to be
been
done.
named,
Right. Yeah.
but there's so much work that needs to be done around it, because it's then, after it's named, then what do you do? And do you raise your hand and say, hey, I'm one of the people that need protection? Because then what are the implications behind untrained providers and teachers and principals that don't really know how to protect you?
Which gets to really a part of what has to happen. These providers and teachers need to be trained, need to be educated, need to understand that, just as you were suggesting, hurtful things that are said when you're a child aren't forgotten just because you're an adult.
Right, right. And you also, you talk about the psychological dimensions of stigma. What are those?
The psychological dimensions of stigma. There are many.
Okay.
I'm trying to think how best to respond to that question.
Or what comes into your office? When people are coming in with issues and they're burdened and they're broken, what shows up in your office? What kinds of things do you have to help people over and over again, time and time, work through?
People feel anxious, people feel depressed, people feel traumatized, people sometimes have post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of early traumatic experiences. Keep in mind that one of the things that happens to LGBT people, they are at increased risk of not only being bullied and teased, but are subjected to violence as well. So when people know people who have been attacked, beaten, sometimes homicides occur.
Or suicides.
Or suicides, yeah. And people who commit suicide typically have a history of things having been done to them, trauma or depression, and sometimes this can be related to the experiences that they've had. We are seeing a lot more in the media now about LGBT people committing suicide.
Yes.
And we have known for a long time that the rates of suicide among LGBT people are much higher than in the general population.
That's right. And that's true for college age, right, as well as those who are beyond the traditional college age. So it's really a sad trend, and I'm hoping that it's reversing. But as you know, it's as we go through this transition period where it's okay to come out, we think, that you have to deal with some of the backlash is the best way for me to describe it, of what that means. And you know, just because we repeal a law or we decide we're going to sign into a bullying act and put it in all the schools, how ready are we to really put those things into practice?
Yeah, it's similar to what happened in 1954. There was the passage of Brown versus Topeka that outlawed segregation in the schools. Well, the schools in Mount Vernon started being segregated then, and they're still segregated.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So there is always the possibility of backlash.
Yeah. So you have this book, Multiple Minority Identities, and you actually wrote chapter 6.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about chapter 6 and some of the really interesting findings that you have in chapter 6.
One of the things I talk about in chapter 6 has to do with diversity in groups, and that in my practice, my practice is very diverse, therefore my groups tend to be very diverse. And so people in my groups can be black, can be white, can be gay, can be straight.
And how do you find that? Does it work well?
I think
when
it
you
works,
have the
because it gives people a window into not only their own personal issues, but the culture as well. And people get to see how people of different backgrounds may have similar as well as different.
Yeah, I was going to say, probably you get into those groups and they find out how much alike they are and how much shared pain they have, regardless of what they look like on the outside, the shared pain on the inside.
Yeah, and they also get to know that people whose backgrounds are very different from their own can support them in that what they share, however different the background is a history of pain of some sort. We think of the whole concept of dysfunctional family. Well, dysfunctional families can be dysfunctional in different ways, and sometimes a person from a white middle-class background who's heterosexual may have had a dysfunctional family and may have a certain kind of pain, but someone else could be white middle-class or black working class who's gay in the same group may have a different kind of history in terms of family acceptance or rejection, and people come to recognize that the folks in the group recognize the pain and support them, and in fact will not stigmatize them, will not attack them, will not say to them, well, you know, if you just stop being gay, this wouldn't happen.
Right. Because pain is pain.
Pain is pain.
Right? So regardless of whether you're middle class white or whether you're black and gay, when you work through these issues in group, it's all pain.
It's all pain.
Yeah. So there's a lot of learnings that probably come out and epiphanies that come out each time. I bet I'd love to be a fly on the wall. I bet you learn so much
Yes.
from just, you know, I know you're conducting the groups and you kind of know everything.
Right.
I know that's true. But I bet there's so much learning to come out of the group piece. I really like groups.
Yeah, I like groups a lot.
Yeah.
And in fact, some of the learning that I do with each and every person I work with and with each and every group that I work with, I have to learn about the person that I see, and only they can tell me.
That's good stuff.
Yeah.
That's good stuff. You talk about becoming comfortable, beginning to master the discomfort in joining, and I guess in the shedding of yourself and participating in a group, because you have to let some things go to become naked in front of a group. But that's the only place healing can take place, right? Is if you let some stuff go.
Yeah. Whether it's in individual or in group, a part of the way I see therapy is that therapy is really working through the anxieties that get in the way of connection. So people have to work through some of that even to join the group.
Wow.
If a person comes to me and wants to join a group, I don't just put them in a group.
Really?
Absolutely not.
Oh, you have to qualify to get in your group, Dr. Nettles?
You have to be prepared.
You have to be prepared.
You have to talk about it, talk about the feelings, talk about the thoughts, talk about the fears.
Right.
You know, we all have fears about joining groups.
Because we have to be prepared to do the work.
Well, we have to get over our own histories.
Yeah. And you know what? And multiple minority identities is where we start. Thank you so much. This has been really, really interesting conversation. I'd like to thank Dr. Reginald Nettles for being my guest. If you would like more information about the topics we discussed, you may contact Dr. Nettles at 410-290-7999, or you can email him at r.nettlesphd@gmail.com, or you can visit his website at www.lgbtc.com. I'm Dr. Cislina Grosser Ledbetter. Thank you for watching.